I'm now porn adjacent. I run a tabletop game stream regularly with some porn stars, which you can check out with suitable precautions in place at tabletopless.org. And just know that I put as much effort into this campaign as I would any other tits or no tits. Hello lovelies, this is my second attempt at making this video because the cats keep scratching at the door and meowing, so if you do hear pathetic meowing and scratching in the background, this time you'll know what it is. Today we're taking a look at Star Trek Adventures. There have been many different Star Trek RPGs over the years. FASA did a version, which I think I played once. There was a D20 version, which I avoided like the plague. There was Last Unicorn Games version. There's Starfleet Battles, which is kind of off-brand, a little bit iffy in terms of intellectual property. And now there's Star Trek Adventures by Modiphius, using their 2D20 system, which they use for everything and probably shouldn't. But it fits here. It works quite well here in Star Trek because it encourages group cooperation, group play, working together as a team, which is very much a hallmark of Star Trek, I think, as an intellectual property, at least up until Discovery. 2D20 system works like this. You roll 2 dice. Get under a certain target number is 1 success. Get under a smaller target number is 2 successes. So normally you're going to get 1 to 4 successes. Certain things can give you additional successes, and you can draw dice from a common pool or put dice into a common pool and draw on that to get that extra degree of success. Don't want to dwell too long on the system because it's probably the least interesting part. If you've played one 2D20 system, you've pretty much played them all. It works for some games better than others. I don't think it particularly works very well for Conan or John Carter of Mars or many of their other properties. I appreciate why they do it. It decreases development time. You've got a well-tested, tried-and-true system that may only need slight tweaks. But you lose synergy between system and setting when you do that. But the main thing that's interesting about Star Trek is not so much the role-playing system that's involved, but the implications of Star Trek as a setting. Now, when I think of Star Trek, being an ancient and crumbly old man as I am, I think of pivotal scenes from the original series of exploration and discovery. The stories that sort of stand out are things like The Horta, for example. Understanding alien life, appreciating differences, finding human or humanitarian solutions to problems rather than necessarily immediately resorting to violence, even when violence has been done to you. Or I think of The Next Generation, which had many of the same themes of science and discovery and understanding and so on, but tempered with a kind of sane progressivism that we don't see anymore. And Next Generation was, once it got into its stride, very much a set of humanist parables, fables, morality plays, whatever you want to call it. There was always a point about being the best version of ourselves as a species, cooperating with others, working together, admitting our flaws and weaknesses. A mostly sane sort of progressive point of view of tolerance and acceptance, and a portrayal of a post-scarcity society where you do things because it's your vocation, it's what appeals to you, and God knows we could use a bit of that with the way things are going in the world, because that's how we're likely to end up, with jobs being something you do because you want to do them, and with your material needs being met, unless we collapse into an arch-capitalist dystopia, of course. Yeah, that's always a possibility. But more recent Trek does not reflect these sensibilities. Recent Trek seems to be much more whiz-bang, explosions, combat, fighting, skullduggery, the worst aspects of humanity. And rather than being a cooperative, team-oriented enterprise, if you'll pardon the pun, it's much more iconoclastic, individualistic, and so on. You look at Discovery, and it is in many ways the antithesis of what Trek was ever supposed to be. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Well, from an intellectual property perspective, I think it is of lower quality these days. It doesn't hang together and make as much sense as it used to. It's become more Star Warsified. I mean, Star Trek was not hard science fiction, but it was towards the harder end of science fiction. There was internal consistency most of the time in the way the technology worked and so on. It wasn't just hand-wavium. The Expanse does that technology-wise, but doesn't show any real social advancement in humanity. And the more recent tracks, Picard, Discovery, even Lower Decks, even though it's a cartoon, very much seems to go against the whole philosophy and direction of the older Trek. From a role-playing standpoint, that may actually be better. Allow me to explain. Most role-playing groups tend to take a more scorched earth approach to problems. They play role-playing games for the strengths of role-playing games, which is independence and freedom of choice and overcoming by whatever means necessary. People like to feel unfettered as their characters, less directed, less pushed, less forced. And so the individualistic, combative, outside the law, outside the culture, outside the expectations of the Federation nature of things, like Discovery, like Picard, like Lower Decks, that tends to fit better with the way in which most role-playing groups play role-playing games. Whereas, if we look at the original series, however Kirk played fast and loose with the rules, or we look at Next Generation, then we see a much more hidebound and structured sort of arc. Star Trek is military role-playing without the explosions most of the time. You're within a military structure. You have a captain that you report to and that you obey, and an admiralty and a whole structure, and the Federation has a lot of rules about first contact and other situations. You know, you are expected to seek diplomatic and humanitarian solutions rather than to go in phases blazing, right? So that is the world of Star Trek. It's a humanitarian, post-scarcity, solve problems without resorting to violence unless absolutely necessary. You're within a rank structure, a civilizational structure that is extremely hidebound and directed. And as a player within that world, you will be following orders. Now that is a godsend for the games master, because they can use that structure to assign you missions, to direct you towards the adventure, rather than dangling cheese in front of you and hoping you'll go for it when it comes to adventures. So that's good from the games master side, but from the player side, you are hemmed in, you're on rails, there are expectations. And if you step outside those expectations and the games master does not bring in the repercussions from the world, then you might as well not be playing Star Trek. Now, there are grey areas. DS9, I think, strikes the ultimate balance between traditional Trek and new Trek. It's probably the kind of setting, the kind of feel for the game that would make the best compromise between old Trek and new Trek for adventures. Because you're still part of the Federation, you're still operating under Federation expectations and so on, but there is more room to maneuver, room to wiggle, to bring in characters like, say, Quark, who can be allies, but don't necessarily suffer under the same moral burden and weight that your Starfleet characters will. But I think the ship has kind of sailed on a lot of that stuff. The new Trek, which is going to be the expectations for people who aren't deep into old Trek lore, is going to be for something more like Discovery, unfortunately. I don't think Discovery is as bad as some people say it is. It's a pretty decent science fiction show. It's just not really Star Trek. There's way too much hand-wavium when it comes to technology and big disasters and so on, and it focuses far too much on a singular individual rather than a team for all the speechifying that goes on that says otherwise. One other rules thing that is worth noting, I think, is when it comes to starships and so on, there are basically two ways you can go in role-playing games. You can go the hyper-technical and statistical route, where you know every in and out of every system and subsystem on a ship, and it's all extremely realistic, or at least plausible within the game world. Or you can take a more story-led route, where a ship is more like equipment, and it has a variety of more abstract traits that might come into things. Fate, particularly Starblazer Adventures, is good for doing that. For a more technical approach, you probably want something like Traveller, which is probably the hardest science fiction game there is that exists, with the toolkits for making ships and so on, and accounting for thrust and gravity and all of that stuff that makes math nerds hard in the pants area. This takes more of a story approach, but there is still enough technicality that it can make sense. Ships are basically treated like characters, which is a good way of dealing with it. They have different statistics and so on. They interact with the characters through the roles. So Starship with better sensor systems, you're going to get better sensor rolls on, and so on. So it makes sense. It's a good compromise, but it is more on the kind of hand-wavy abstract side, but not fully. Is that good for Trek? For the newer Trek, and as a compromise to enable role-playing, I think it works. But there are a lot of Star Trek nerds who are heavily into the configurations and the technical details of the ships, who may feel a bit disappointed in what they find here, where the deep technical detail is lacking. Race, or species more properly, is pretty important in Star Trek. None of the species choices really feel like they make a huge difference to statistics and so on, given that most Star Trek aliens are just humans with bits of rubber on their foreheads or their noses. That's fair enough, in so much as it's fair enough. And you've got a lot of the core races from the various time periods of Trek, but what's really missing that would have been a better approach, I think, is something more like what I did with Machinations of the Space Princess, which is where you have rules for creating your own races and a handful of examples. Because if there is a motto to the Federation, it's diversity is our strength, I think. So being able to create and introduce new species rather than being necessarily completely tied to canon would have been a good approach, I think. Nor are there enough starship classes. Now fans have created a lot more species, a lot more starships and so on. You can find all that online, so you can access that and customize things. But having ship creation rules would also have been a very nice thing to have in the main rulebook, and then to perhaps save a lot of the examples for the various supplements, other than a few sort of standard ship designs that you might run into and use otherwise during play. What else is there to say about this, really? I guess I can dig into the style and substance. As you may have noticed, virtually every page is black with light writing on the black background. I have nothing against that. You'll also note that a lot of it is set up to look like the pad displays in Next Generation and DS9. I don't mind this as a choice, and I certainly find it easier to read on a screen if I'm looking at a PDF of the book. On the page, however, when it's relentlessly dark, it can be a little bit of an eye strain. I found the artwork isn't particularly good. I'm glad they didn't go for taking photographs, production stills, and so on. But the artwork has the usual problems that I complain about in most modern RPGs, in that it's muddy, low contrast. It doesn't pop off the page. It doesn't grab your attention, and not all of this is the artist's fault. I don't think StarTrek necessarily lends itself to great artwork, because so much of the time it's people standing around talking, engaged in diplomacy and so on. The GM section is okay. It's not particularly deep on the information, but then if you want more information, you can watch the series, or there are plenty of Star Trek wikis, Memory Alpha, and so on online. There's a few adversaries. Don't put the Borg in every episode. You're not Voyager. But again, you can get all the more useful information on these cultures and so on in online wikis by fans. It doesn't tie itself to any particular era. I mean, this is part of the problem with the 2D20 system, in that it's not particularly granular. There isn't that much difference between one weapon and another weapon, so you'll just find yourself, one phaser is as good as the next, pretty much. Lug Trek, Last Unicorn Games version of Trek, went into all the different phaser settings. You don't really see that here. So you can't go to setting 16 and blow up an entire outpost, which is, good from a GM's point of view, I suppose, but isn't accurate, and isn't necessarily as much fun. So you can't rifts it up in this, unfortunately. Where would I set it? Well, the Trek timeline is so utterly filled, and Trek fans tend to be so lore-obsessed, that I think I would set it after DS9, after the Dominion War, after Voyager, but before Picard. That's where I would probably set it. There's a nice gap there, even though you've got the adventures of Titan, USS Titan, and so on in secondary material. It's fairly open. You've got all the players there. You can incorporate whatever you want, pretty much, into that. So final words then. This is the second best Star Trek game, I think, after Lug Trek, but with a system that is better suited in most of the time. I don't think it needs that much customization of the 2D20 systems. I think this is one of the better ones because it encourages teamwork and group interaction. In terms of style, I'm afraid it's going to be a 3 out of 5, but it's a high 3. The artwork just isn't that engaging or good. The cover isn't that engaging or good. It doesn't pop off the page. The layout was a bold choice, but I don't think it necessarily works particularly well. It's certainly thematic, but for a reference book, I think you need to prioritize readability, unless you're creating a short book like Morkborg or something. But this is not a short book. In terms of substance, it's all there. Everything that you need is there, but it lacks the more general sort of utilitarian aspects, such as species creation, ship creation. You just have to customize what's already there. Otherwise, between this and online wikis, you've got everything you need to play out of the main book. So in terms of substance, I think a 4 out of 5 is certainly reasonable. So that gives us a total of 7 out of 10 are 3.5 out of 5. Worth it if you're a Trek fan, but not for the kind of technical detail that you would have gotten from past incarnations of Star Trek. Sang.
Tal, friend, and welcome to Gore. Savage and beautiful, John Norman's Gorean saga is brought to life in the Tales of Gore role-playing game and its companion world book, World of Gore. Take flight on a tarn, luxuriate in the bathhouses of Ar, pit your steel against the deadly Kuri, best your enemies and place them in your collar. Tales of Gore uses the D6 system, perfect for both new and old players. You can purchase it from Amazon, RPG Now, or Lulu.com. Ta Sada Gore!